What can the neurodiversity movement learn from LGBT plus history? This century, neurodivergent people are waging similar battles to those waged by LGBT plus people in the last century. We share many experiences and issues, such as, well, there's the Pathologizing of Difference. That book there is called the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. Homosexuality was in there until 1973, and neurodivergent conditions, many of them, still are in there. There's a common narrative that affects both communities, and of course those who fit into both communities, as being not normal. And you can see this in some of the insults that are regularly thrown at us. So queer, for instance, although obviously that has been reclaimed by a substantial part of the LGBT plus movement. Neurodivergent people will often find themselves being called weird or weirdos. There are attempts to cure us, efforts to have a gay cure, and efforts to cure autism rather than to accept it. Or if not cure us, then maybe convert us. There's an active campaign against LGBT plus conversion therapy, and there's also campaigning and strong opinion amongst particularly autistic people against some of the therapies that are offered that in practice seek to make autistic people, primarily autistic children, act non-autistic. And here's an interesting quote from Ivor Lovaas, who was one of the founders of applied behavioural analysis, who revealed some of the thinking behind it with this quote. You see, you start pretty much from scratch when you work with an autistic child. You have a person in the physical sense. They have hair, a nose and a mouth, but they are not people in the psychological sense. One way to look at the job of helping autistic kids is to see it as a matter of constructing a person. You have the raw materials, but you have to build the person. And then there's the questions that society asks themselves about what causes us. And to be clear, I have no problem with finding out what causes the things that we're talking about. My concern is about the way in which the question is asked, because what you hear is what causes dyslexia, what causes dyspraxia, what causes ADHD, etc., rather than what causes different brains to develop differently. Similarly, you hear the question, what causes homosexuality, rather than what causes different people to develop different sexualities. The difference being is those first questions, the one on the left of the slide, treat us as the other. It's why are you different from the normal people? And there has been a history of answering these questions by blaming mothers. Here's the New York Times in the 1970s reassuring us that parents aren't always to blame for homosexuality, strongly implying that they usually are. And this fellow is called Bruno Bettelheim. He had a notorious theory that autism was caused by mothers who don't show enough affection to their babies. It became known as the refrigerator mother theory, long since discredited. Yeah, there's people who pray for us, for LGBT people and for neurodivergent people. There's hate crime directed at us. So this is one of many, many thousands I could have included on here. It's in memory of a 16-year-old trans woman in Brazil who was shot dead just 5 years ago. And here's a headline that shows findings about the quite shocking, actually, level of hate crime directed against autistic people. We have a shared experience amongst LGBT plus people and neurodivergent people of police brutality. That placard there reminds us that the first Pride, the Stonewall riot, was a riot against police brutality. And this is a Black Lives Matter protest demanding justice for Marcus, who was an autistic Black American who was killed by the police. And even where there's not police brutality, we might find police negligence. In 2014, 2015 in East London in the UK, a serial killer murdered 4 gay men, and it soon became clear that the police hadn't taken it seriously, hadn't acted on leads they could have acted on, and that at least some of those men died unnecessarily because the police's actions were driven by negligence, may be driven by homophobia. And similarly, this fella, he's called Daniel Smith, he repeatedly reported to police the harassment and attacks he was receiving as an autistic man, but they didn't take him seriously. Eventually they settled, but he still felt let down and unsafe. Borders, immigration controls cause a great deal of distress and discrimination against both LGBT plus people and neurodivergent people. Here are some campaigners in support of LGBTI asylum seekers and refugees. And this fellow is called Osim Brown. He was threatened with deportation from Britain to Jamaica after falling foul of the law which treated him unfairly as a young black autistic man. Certainly, LGBT plus people and neurodivergent people have a shared experience of inequality and disadvantage in the workplace. And with service cuts, inadequate healthcare and waiting lists, all of which hit working class people harder. So with this shared experience of disadvantage and oppression, it stands to reason there could be a shared experience of fighting back, and that the neurodiversity movement, which is kind of younger than the LGBT plus movement, has a lot to learn from a movement that came before it and has won such a lot over the years. So here are some of the lessons, I think. The centrality of campaigning for the principle that difference is not disorder. So homosexuality was taken out of the DSM, which I mentioned earlier, in 1973, but only as a result of campaigning. Now neurodivergent conditions are still in it, while some activists are arguing, rightly I think, that it would be better for them to be listed in a different document that identifies them as differences, as neurominorities, rather than as disorders. I think there's a massive lesson about mobilisation, about getting out of the closets and onto the street, mass demonstrations, big protests, campaigning direct action, etc. And unionising as well. Trade unions have done a lot to support the advancement of LGBT rights in Britain and elsewhere. And unions are doing a lot on the issue of neurodiversity. Solidarity is an essential lesson for us all to learn. Here we have delegates at the RMT Trade Union's Disabled Members Conference in 2021 expressing their solidarity with Osim Brown as part of a campaign which, together with several demonstrations and 500,000 people signing an online petition, stopped Osim's deportation and won his right to stay in the UK. And here is a banner of lesbians and gays support the miners, looking back at the time when huge advances were made because of the solidarity shown by lesbians and gay men to the miners' strike in the 1980s. Pride. So the annual LGBT plus Pride events are very well known now, very well established in the calendar. Perhaps less well known is Autistic Pride. It's on the 18th of June every year. It's nothing like the scale of Gay Pride as yet. It's largely picnics with speakers and performers maybe. But it's a movement that can grow. And activists are also really stressing that Pride, that our movement, etc., its aim is for liberation, and we resent, I suppose, oppose profiteering from it. And there's people speaking out against profiteering from autistic people, people speaking out there that queer liberation, not rainbow capitalism. Diversity within diversity. And what I mean by this is that it is significant that what started as the gay rights movement is now the LGBT plus movement, and that what started off as an autistic rights movement has diversified into a neurodiversity movement. And our struggles have a cultural front as well, whether it's an anthology of poetry by neurodivergent writers, whether it's artworks with the infinity neurodiversity symbol, whether it's African LGBT plus film festivals, etc. It's an important aspect of how we campaign for it. Both movements oppose abuse. There we have a demonstration against abuse of trans young people, children in Texas, and here we have a demonstration against abuse of autistic people in the UK. And I guess the concluding thing really is to emphasise that the advances that have been made, and there have been big advances in LGBT plus rights over the years have not been handed down for us as a gift from on high. They've not been won by polite, persuasive argument. They've been won by mobilisation, sometimes very forceful mobilisation. A turning point in the gay liberation movement, as it became known in the wake of the Stonewall riot, was the police raiding the Stonewall bar in New York and the clientele fighting back. And we would all do well to remember that that's how we started to build a combative, effective movement that has brought us such a long way. And that, I think, is a key lesson for the neurodiversity movement to learn. So to conclude, let's learn from history and let's fight for the future.